the world began to change in a way it never had before. This was the industrial era, a time of great invention and transformation. It started in Great Britain around the late 1700s and soon spread across the globe. Before this, most people lived in the countryside, working on farms. Their lives were guided by the rising and setting of the sun. But then, new machines were invented. These machines could spin thread and weave cloth faster than any human could. To house these powerful new inventions, giant buildings called factories were constructed. They were often powered by steam, a remarkable force harnessed from boiling water. This great shift brought people from their quiet farms to bustling, crowded cities. They came in search of work, hoping for a better life. The cities grew at an astonishing rate, becoming the new centers of human activity. Smoke from the factory chimneys filled the air, a constant sign of this new industrial power. The promise of steady wages was a powerful lure for families who had previously depended on the unpredictable nature of farming. This was more than just a change in where people lived. It was a complete reshaping of society, creating new opportunities but also new and unforeseen challenges for humanity. It is here, in these new noisy cities, that a dark chapter began to unfold. The factories and mines, hungry for workers, did not discriminate by age. The demand for labor was immense, and the supply of people willing to work for low pay was just as large. The very machines that represented progress also created a need for a new kind of workforce. And so the era of machines became entangled with a difficult and painful story, the story of its youngest and most vulnerable workers. This was a world driven by production, where the rhythm of life was no longer set by nature, but by the relentless turning of gears. This period of history shows us a remarkable human ingenuity. The ability to create machines that could perform such complex tasks was truly extraordinary. It laid the foundation for the modern world we know today, with all its technological marvels. However, it also serves as a stark reminder. It shows us that great change can come with a great cost. The rush for progress and profit can sometimes overshadow the most basic of human needs. And in the heart of the industrial era, one of the greatest costs was paid by the children. Child labor was not a new phenomenon. Children had always worked on family farms, helping with chores suited to their abilities. But what happened in the factories and mines of the industrial era was entirely different. This was not about helping the family in the fresh air of the countryside. Instead, it was organized, relentless work in dangerous and unhealthy environments. Children as young as 5 or 6 were sent to work long hours for very little pay. Their small size, which we now see as a sign of youth and innocence, was seen by factory owners as an advantage. Families were often faced with a difficult choice. Poverty was widespread, and many households struggled simply to put food on the table. The wages of an adult were often not enough to support a family, so the tiny contribution from a child's wage could make the difference between eating and starving. Factory owners took advantage of this desperation. They could pay children far less than adults for the same or even more work. Children were also seen as more manageable and less likely to protest against the terrible conditions, making them an ideal workforce in the eyes of some employers. The types of jobs given to children were often the most perilous. Their small, nimble fingers were considered perfect for media group, child reaching into moving textile machinery, historical photo, children fixing threads in textile mills, at stock at distribute _equally, reaching into complex moving machinery to fix broken threads in textile mills. This was incredibly hazardous work. A moment of distraction could lead to a lost finger, a mangled hand, or even worse. In the coal mines, children known as trappers would sit in complete darkness for up to 12 hours a day. Their only job was to open and close a wooden door to let the coal carts pass through, a task vital for maintaining air circulation deep underground. Other children worked as scavengers, crawling underneath the powerful looms to pick up scraps of cotton, a constant risk of being crushed by the heavy moving parts. Some worked in glass factories, enduring intense heat, or in match factories where they were exposed to toxic phosphorus that could cause a terrible disease known as phossy jaw, which painfully rotted away the jawbone. These were not simply jobs. They were daily battles for survival, fought by the youngest members of society in the most unforgiving of arenas. Their childhood was sacrificed for the sake of industry. The daily life of a working child was one of immense hardship and monotony. The day would begin long before sunrise, with a small, simple meal, if any was available. They would then walk through the dark, dirty streets to the factory or mine, places that would be their whole world for the next 12 to 16 hours. There was no time for play, no opportunity for education. The noise inside the factories was deafening, a constant clatter and roar of machinery that never seemed to stop. The air was thick with dust and fibers which filled their young lungs and led to chronic illness. Discipline within these workplaces was harsh and often cruel. Children who were late or who grew tired and slowed down were frequently beaten by the overseers. Exhaustion was a constant companion, and falling asleep on the job was a common yet dangerous occurrence. They were treated not as children but as small parts of the larger industrial machine. Their well-being was secondary to the factory's output. At the end of the long, grueling day, they would trudge home, often too tired to eat, only to collapse into bed for a few short hours of sleep before the cycle began all over again. This relentless routine left no room for the joys of being young. The world outside the factory walls was largely unknown to them. They did not chase balls in open fields or listen to stories told by their parents. Their hands, which should have been learning to write or draw, were instead calloused and scarred from their labor. The lack of proper nutrition, combined with the physically demanding work, meant that many children were small for their age and suffered from stunted growth and deformities. Their bodies were being broken by the work they were forced to do. This existence had a profound impact, not just on their bodies, but on their spirits. A childhood without laughter, learning, or love is a hollow one. These children were being deprived of the very essence of what it means to grow up. Their view of the world was shaped by the grim reality of their daily labor. They were old before their time, carrying the burdens of adulthood on their small shoulders. The industrial era, for all its great achievements, was built upon the stolen childhoods of an entire generation of young souls. For a long time, this exploitation of children was seen by many as a necessary part of this new industrial world. However, a growing number of people began to see the profound injustice of it all. Reformers, writers, and compassionate politicians started to raise their voices. They wrote articles, gave speeches, and published reports that detailed the horrific conditions these children endured. They worked to open the eyes of the public to the suffering that was happening right in their midst. It was a slow and difficult process, like a tiny seed struggling to grow in hard soil. These efforts eventually led to the creation of new laws. In Great Britain, a series of acts known as the Factory Acts were passed throughout the 1800s. The early laws were often weak and poorly enforced, but they were a start. The Act of 1833 was a significant step forward. It banned the employment of children under the age of 9 in textile factories and limited the working hours for older children. It also introduced the idea of factory inspectors, individuals who were tasked with going into the workplaces to ensure the new rules were being followed. These legal changes were crucial, but they were not the only force for change. As the years went on, society itself began to evolve. Trade unions grew stronger, fighting for better wages and conditions for all workers, which made families less dependent on the income of their children. The idea that childhood should be a time for education and development rather than labor began to take root. More schools were built and laws were eventually passed making education compulsory for all children. This was a fundamental shift in thinking. Remembering this dark chapter is incredibly important. It reminds us of the vulnerability of children and our collective responsibility to protect them. The story of child labor during the industrial era is not just a piece of history, it is a lesson. It teaches us that economic progress should never be pursued at the expense of human dignity. And it shows us the power of compassion and advocacy to bring about positive change. By understanding this past, we can better appreciate the protections that exist for children today and remain vigilant to ensure that such exploitation never happens on that scale again.